Now, a look at food policy in the United States. It's sort of a twin topic, I believe, as far as our studies go in policy, and that food and housing seem to go well. They don't. They're not the same issue by any stretch of the imagination, but they go very much hand in hand in terms of being related to basic needs of our existence. And so I think it's fitting that the two topics be presented in proximity to each other. The text tells us that 48 million Americans were living in food insecure households in 2014. The more recent statistics that I found in 2017 estimated that number to be about 40 million Americans. Now, this tells you that the number of food insecure households are decreasing on in the bigger picture of things. Now, there are different reasons for that, perhaps, but this still includes about 12 million children and about 1 in 8 Americans. This information comes from a website called feedingamerica.org. In a year's time, about 1 in 4 Americans participate in at least one of 15 programs that the United States Department of Agriculture administers, totaling altogether about $116 billion in expenditures in 2016 alone. So these are very important programs in our nation's social welfare network. Nonetheless, more than two-thirds of Americans are overweight, and it almost seems contradictory, except when you think about the way Americans eat and what we eat these days. More than a third of Americans are obese. According to the text, almost 3 in 4 American men are overweight or obese, which surprises me, but nonetheless, that's what we're reading. Um, and the prevalence of being overweight and obesity really is greater in lower socioeconomic groups, and this suggests that there's a link between income and the reliance upon inexpensive foods and fast foods that have poor nutritional value. So some of the most food insecure households are also the same households that have the highest rates of obesity. And obesity, of course, is a major problem in many respects because it leads to health issues such as diabetes, and among children and their parents leads to medical conditions that create absences, cause absences from school and work, oftentimes resulting in higher claims and insurance, and so on. So it's it's a concern simply beyond hunger. It's a concern for Americans and the economy in many respects. Now, here's a graph that I pulled from, it's actually a USDA graph pulled from a Feeding America website. It shows the rate of food insecure households, or well, the percentage of the United States population living in food insecure households from the year 2000 until, well, this looks like 2018 on this graph, 2017. And you see, of course, the impact of the Great Recession that it had on food insecurity. And I suspect that's the recovery from that, and the lowering of the unemployment rate and those kinds of things over the last several years is the reason why the number of food insecure households has decreased. Not that the problem of hunger in America is going away by any stretch, but more Americans had obtained, I think, obtained employment and were able to, provide consistent foods for their children. The USDA had a budget in 2016 of $156 billion, and 43% of that was focused upon means tested food and nutrition programs. That includes things like SNAP and WIC and some other programs that we'll be touching on here in a bit. About $18 billion subsidizes less than a half a million family farms. Now, 18 billion for a half a million family farms, but if you look at TANF, there's 15 billion that supports 4 million recipients who live below the poverty line. So you see, there's a lot of fuss about these programs administered by HHS for needy individuals, and yet when it comes to family farms and those kinds of things, there's less of a fuss about that, even though more money is being invested in those support programs. Families cope with hunger in many different ways, and so when you have a food insecure household, poverty is almost always present, of course, in those situations, and families have to make choices in ways they sometimes cope with uh, with poverty is to skip meals, which of course sometimes causes malnutrition and contributes to the problem of low birth weight babies. As a nation, we spend a smaller percentage of our income on food than any other nation on the globe, and in fact, we have surplus foods, which is interesting given that we have hungry people, but we have surplus foods that we feed to other parts of the world to help deal with their particular food issues. But in 2014, 17.4 million American households were still food insecure, and women and children made up about 75% of those persons in those households. And in 2014, that same year, about 17.4 million people were fed by food pantries and soup kitchens. Now, just to kind of take a look a little bit at the connection between food insecurity and poverty and unemployment, you can see here how again, this is sort of the same period of time. You can see how the three social factors are really closely intertwined. And while all of them are coming down at present time, in if you look at this, food insecurity and poverty continues to be at a higher level than they were in at the beginning of the century, while unemployment rate is only slightly higher than it was at the beginning of the century, according to this data from the USDA. But you can see the close relationship between poverty and food insecurity here. When children are undernourished, there are all sorts of problems that arise from that, aside from just illness and hunger. Children wind up having trouble concentrating, which of course is going to affect their ability to learn in school. They have difficulty bonding with other children. They're more likely to be absent from school because of health issues. They're more likely to perform poorly on standardized tests, are at greater risk of dropping out of school, and potentially suffer brain, cognitive, and psychological impairments that at times can be irreversible, even as the economic situation improves in a home. So we're talking about long-lasting, sometimes permanent impact upon the cognitive functioning and academic capacities of children in food insecure homes. In addition to that, there's an increased risk of suicide during adolescence in this group. Now, the national average of food insecure households hovers around 17.4%, but within those figures, of course, when you look at them more specifically, many groups have rates of food insecurity much higher. For instance, households with incomes below the poverty line is 43%. Households with children headed by single women, 36.6%, and black households, 25%, and Hispanics, 27%. Like healthcare in America, food is a commodity. If you don't have money for it, you just don't get it. And if our society was such that if you didn't have money, you didn't get food. If there were no support programs in place, the marketplace would allow people to starve. So the state has a responsibility, we believe, to redistribute our resources, to those who are needy. And so there are a few ways that the state provides or fulfills that function through the United States Department of Agriculture in their food programs. And one of them is, of course, the Supplemental Nutrition or SNAP program. I think it's originally enacted by Congress in the 1960s as the food stamp program, and became actually at the time, I don't think they may have actually, I think originally they were stamps actually, but eventually became coupons. And my first job out of my bachelor's training, in fact, was working as a food stamp certification worker in Orlando during a comparatively mild, but it wasn't mild, a recession in the mid 1970s, and a lot of people were coming in for assistance that never had reached out for assistance before during that period of time. And in those days, you would do the eligibility test, and I think the text actually gives you a page that kind of exposes you to what how the eligibility guidelines are implemented in the SNAP program. And so you sit down, the person has to bring in their receipts and everything. You sit down and you go through their income and their expenses, and there's certain disregards for different kinds of income. There's allowances made for, the rent or mortgage, and for utilities, and those kinds of things. And then after all those expenses are, considered and disregards are made in income, then there was a certain income level that was established that was the family's income. And then based upon that income and the number of persons in the household, then that would determine how much they would be eligible to receive up to a certain amount. There are limits. Again, those are, I believe, in the text, in terms of the number of members of the household, the maximum amount of benefits you can get. So an individual might not be have received full benefits, but would only, might only because of their income get half of the benefits that they would otherwise be eligible to receive. When I worked there in those days, they would have to go. I don't exactly remember what we gave them, but they would go to a window, and the food stamp office was like a bank, and they would go to the window and they would turn in their certification form that showed how many benefits or how many dollars in benefits they were eligible for. And in those days, they might have to pay some money to get it, depending upon their income, in order to get their $144 in food stamps for a family of two or three. They might have to pay $25 for that. Well, that was fine, except that if they were broke, if they didn't have any money, they couldn't get their food stamps. And what we called them zero issuance clients were very controversial with the conservative people in our office at the time. But in any event, not long after I went to work in other social service programs, the government did away with that cash requirement, so that instead of having to pay $25 for $125 worth of food stamps, they would just get $100 worth of food stamps rather than the full 125. Now, of course, you don't get these coupons anymore, but they have cards that they swipe just like a regular credit card. There are certain items that can be purchased with SNAP benefits, certain items that cannot be purchased, and they are all food items. It doesn't cover things like toiletries and things like that that are necessities. So, and cigarettes not permitted, those kinds of things. And so, and in any event, this program funded entirely by the federal government, with the states sharing in administrative costs. And there are, of course, income guidelines that the family has to be at 130% of poverty guidelines or below that after the disregards of income. One difference about this program from other programs is that people don't have to be related to qualify as a household. So that if a group of people were living together in shared cooking facilities and ate together, then they could receive food stamps as a family unit. And I think that's still the case with the SNAP program. If an individual went in and wanted to apply just for himself or herself, they would have to have a separate shelf established for their food, a separate shelf in the refrigerator that's theirs, and not mix their things with others. There are a lot of different kinds of requirements for this program, but in any event, as you know, in recent times, the leadership has focused upon SNAP recipients and trying to require more work from these individuals before, or to require that they are working in order to receive these benefits, those kinds of things. And well, anyway, it's just another part of the bigger picture of conservative leadership and how they want to deal with social programs such as this. It's interesting that although when you receive TANF benefits, you're pretty much automatically eligible for food stamps or SNAP benefits, but only 13% of those receiving SNAP benefits are TANF eligible individuals. And there are a couple of reasons for that we're going to touch on in a moment. But one of them is the fact, again, that food insecurity really reaches into the middle class in many respects, as well as to the working class, as well as the lower socioeconomic groups. Another program from the USDA that's very important and popular actually is the WIC Women's Infant and Children Program, which was enacted originally in 1972. And this is focused upon pregnant women and women with breastfeeding women and women with small children, providing both education and nutritional counseling as well as supplemental foods for those individuals. The children up to 5 years of age are eligible for this if a healthcare professional has determined them to be at nutritional risk and they meet certain requirements regarding residency and income. If you're SNAP recipient, Medicaid recipient, or TANF eligible, you I believe automatically women and these children would automatically qualify for WIC. So sometimes the WIC program provides actual food benefits, but more often the recipients receive vouchers for those basic heavily nutritional items of milk, cheese, eggs, infant formula, cereals, fruits, and vegetables. And they can be, of course, particularly for young children, proper nutrition is so very vital to their development and these formative years in their physical development. And so this is such an essential, very, very important program for those children from poor and potentially food insecure households. This is a program that is not an entitlement program like TANF and SNAP and Medicaid. So there's a limited fund, and in fact, Congress I think re-ups this program every year. From time to time, you'll hear conservative leadership in particular want to cut WIC benefits, and there's always an uprising of opposition to that, and I think that there's for good reason, as you'll see in a moment, for many different things. But in 2016, 8.5 million women and children received benefits at a total cost of about $6.5 billion. Other programs from the USDA that you've heard about or most likely are very familiar with: child and adult care food programs for disabled adults or children, school lunch program, the free and reduced lunches, school breakfast programs, summer food service programs. I remember in Kenai that the alternative high school would open their cafeteria in the summer for those young people. Many of their students, at least, were living independently or were homeless, or were living in low-income homes, and so a concern is when schools close, then for the summer. For some of those children from food insecure homes, it's one of the few certain meals they get in a day or in a week in a day. And so when school closes, they go for 3 months without that food. And so the summer food service program opens up the school, and students can get a meal through that program. And I remember the alternative school would open in the summer and serve meals to their students while school was out of session. Meals on Wheels is another one you're familiar with for elderly people. Congregate meal dining program where I believe they supplement meals for like in senior centers and things like that in the community. Now sometimes there are small copays for some of these programs, but they're very helpful for populations at risk. WIC is described as one of the most successful and cost-effective nutrition intervention programs, and that's for very good reason. But because of the budget limitations, only about half of the people that would be eligible for these benefits actually can get the benefits. But research shows that WIC improves diet and infant feeding practices. It increases immunization rates, improves access to regular medical care. It improves the cognitive development of young children. And among those participants, improves birth outcomes and contains healthcare costs. That's an important factor here again for those individuals who are focused upon budgetary issues and how much a program costs. This is a program that contains healthcare costs in other ways in other areas. So, because through WIC, that we find studies showing that there are lower or rather longer pregnancies, fewer premature births, fewer low birth weight infants, fewer infant deaths, and increased likelihood of prenatal care. All these things are going to reduce healthcare costs later. And so the studies have demonstrated, depending upon what study you're looking at, that for every dollar spent on WIC, healthcare savings alone range from somewhere from $1.77 to $3.13. So you see, that's money that's very well invested. For people that are coming off the TANF program, after their 2 year limit or their 5 years total limit rather, um, food insecurity often, or going out to work, getting work, and usually those jobs are really not very well paying jobs. The wages are usually very low, and health benefits, other kinds of benefits, oftentimes aren't there. Food insecurity persists and sometimes increases after they no longer have welfare benefits. So different state studies have shown that even when those individuals are working, they don't make enough money to buy food all the time. About a fifth of the families who remained off welfare for a year in one of those studies used food banks or borrowed money to buy food after a year. They were still needing to do that. That it's just primarily because the wages are so insufficient that their other basic needs have to take priority. Childcare, transportation. If you don't have those, you can't work. Housing, and so what happens is a lot of those poor working families cut their food budget to make ends meet because they can't cut those other things out of it, and so oftentimes they have to turn to food pantries and soup kitchens and charities for help. Now, what this tells us is the welfare to work programs aren't really working all that well. Uh, People are coming off of welfare, but they're not coming out of poverty by any means, and so at least since the early 90s, hunger relief agencies report that the greatest increase in hunger has been among the working poor. The text spends the second part of the chapter looking at farms and farmers, and this is an area where although I grew up around farmers and I'm now living among farmers and know a lot about the farming culture, I think never worked on a farm and never participated in the economies of farms, and so some of this is not something that comes naturally to me. But you hear a lot about price supports for farmers and subsidies, and during the sort of the trade wars of the first couple of years of the Trump administration that have been set up. The farmers. I know the farmers locally here in Indiana are big growers of soybeans, and soybeans one of those crops that China has been buying quite heavily, and there's been a lot of concern about how that's going to impact their ability to sell their soybeans and what it's going to do to the price of soybeans and that kind of thing as the demand falls. And so the government responds by subsidizing the farmers to make up for the loss of profits in their crops. So all of this is a part of American food policy as well as those benefits. Now we're supporting working people here, and we're supporting farmers, and farmers really are sort of one of those iconic kind of images of the American independence, and so I don't want you to think that I'm not supportive of farmers or anything like this, but we have to look at the reality of the thing that the government involvement in with farmers is in many respects is a welfare intervention just as much as it is with needy families. Now, a good example of this is the parity program, which I don't think is even in existence any longer. But farmers have and farming associations have advocated for parity, and what that means basically is they want the government to guarantee a certain price for their crops that will balance out the income that they receive against the money that they have to invest in order to produce that food. Now, their job is essential to America and really to the world. You know, the production of food is something that we all require and need, and so certainly there's some logic to uh, to their request from the government to provide support to them in performing this very essential um, service. But parity is an issue that's been of was has been and continues to be, I think, when it comes up, great um, controversy among when, especially free market people and all of that. And so, anyway, the parity program was ended. At least the formal farm parity program was ended in 1953. Jimmy Carter was a farmer, a peanut farmer, and I can remember I was living in Florida during his administration, and driving through Georgia in the during his administration, they were very, very upset with him because he wasn't as supportive of farm subsidies and things. There was some economic issues during the Carter administration as well, and the farmers were really kind of turned on him, and may very well be part of the reason why he didn't get reelected. There's a lot of politics involved in farming and the support for farmers, and so and a lot of people believe that any kind of price supports, subsidies, and those kinds of things really is a sort of a socialist agenda, the government, kind of equalizing things for farmers, and the government then becomes the guarantor of our food supply and those kinds of things. So when you talk to a politician, particularly one from the farming area, they conjure up these images of the small family farm, and I have to tell you the values that the text talks about, this hard work, independence, strong sense of family, close knit communities, all of that, living in growing up in a farming area in Pennsylvania, and now living in an area in northeastern Indiana, you see a lot of that in the individuals and the persons around here. There's a lot of conservative politics and those kinds of things that kind of tie in many respects to those basic Phyllis Day social or American values that again that we talked about early in the semester, and so when we talk about the farmer, this is the image that the politicians want to think about. These family farms, yeah, I think it says somewhere that they make up 88% of the farms in the nation, uh, but they have the numbers of small family farms are decreasing rather dramatically. Larger farms are taking over, and for, small family farms are going away, and people are giving up their farms or losing their farms. Some farmers have to go out and get other jobs because they're not making enough money in producing anymore because of the competition they have, at least in part because of the competition they have with larger farming interests. And so some of these farms fail. And as the texts say, a lot of people point to the fact that these farms have been handed down through the generations. And when a farm fails or a farmer ends his farming business, he isn't just going to get another job in another part. He's really kind of failing to hand down the family legacy to the next generation. In addition to that, farmers, as the text points out, many of the people who are very invested in farming also are aging, and many of the younger um, children of those farms aren't really interested in continuing to farm, and probably because they see the struggle, at least in part, they see the struggle their parents and grandparents are going through, trying to keep the farm going and making it a profitable. Um, Year after year, there are farm bills. There was recently a farm bill before Congress, and that's where a lot of the debate about SNAP benefits occurred. As a matter of fact, there were some threats to cut SNAP benefits. That is a part of farm policy. And remember that the food stamp program and the SNAP program not only provides food for food insecure homes for poor people and for needy individuals, but it also provides support for farms in enlarging the market of people who can purchase their crops. So the SNAP program and the WIC program and those other programs, support the farmers as well. But other kinds of parts of the farm bill here, as you see, includes things like, crop insurance and disaster assistance and infrastructure issues, research, times direct payments, like I was talking about, the subsidies because of the to farmers because of the embargoes I'm sorry, tariffs that are being implemented on foreign governments, including some of our crops, all those kinds of things. And so there are many different things that Congress does to try to support uh, farmers through this process. Um, Now, there are a number of issues that the text talks about in terms of farmers that um, certainly do relate to food policy to an extent, but then again, maybe doesn't. But ethanol is one of those things. Now, a lot of the crops that are being grown, of course, in this particular area and any area I've ever been, corn, wheat, soybeans, and the text points out that about a quarter of the grain and corn crops that are grown in the United States goes to the ethanol production for cars alone. Ethanol added to the gasoline, and there are pros and cons and debates about whether ethanol contributes or to a better environment or harms the environment, and well, and it makes us less dependent upon oil, those types of things. It's a bit of a controversial product, but it's been something that's been helpful to the farmers, at least in increasing their market for these crops. And now, as I've been saying, the number of small farms is decreasing, and that's a lot of small farmers, family farmers, have had to rely upon outside work. And although small farms make up almost all the farms in the United States, the larger farms are the ones that compete more effectively at an economic level and are more viable economically. It's interesting here that half of the United States land is farmland. That's about 1 billion acres, I think the text says. But in 1990, now this is some time ago, but 4% of the landowners held almost half of the farmland. I'm sure that figure is larger now because the number of small farms is decreasing and the number of larger farms is increasing proportionally. Small farms control then, about half of the U.S. farmland, but they only account for about 22% of the production. Now, the text talks about them being more efficient in some respects, but in a larger sense, the larger farms are economically more competitive. At least they produce larger amounts of food just because they can afford these huge machines that, farming is so different now. Even some of the small farmers, the combines that they have now and everything like that hardly even need an operator anymore. They get in and punch out coordinates, and the machine knows right where to turn and those kinds of things. I mean, now these are expensive machines, and you can be sure that many, if not most, of the small family farms don't have them yet. But these are the things that the larger farms are able to access much more easily. In addition to the just the larger farms that the text talks about, the text also refers to factory farms, and I think these are just like huge concerns where they focused on perhaps one product, and um, I, comes to mind here up the road. There's, if I remember correctly, it was a pig farm, and my I, I've told you my older brother was a parish priest, and his rectory was he's retired since, but his rectory was across a field from a pig farm, and he was west of the pig farm. So In this area, fortunately, most of our weather comes from the west, and most of our winds come from the west. I guess they're westerly then, and and but at times when the winds came from the east, um, it was really difficult. And we're talking about being perhaps a half a mile away from this pig farm anyway. It was really difficult sometimes to walk around outside that rectory when the wind was blowing in the wrong direction because of the smells and the odors coming from this. And it's a pretty large concern, but it's not a gigantic pig farm, but it's a large concern. And these are buildings, and you can be sure that, well, all those kinds of things you hear about these mass productions, that set up a lot of waste and a lot of disease and things like this, and that's an issue that the text mentions. Is the kind of environmental hazards that these factory farms create. So, in any event, just like in the general economy, the largest and wealthiest of the farms receive the largest subsidies from the government, and the small family farmer, the ones that the politicians are always holding up as the example of the all-American way, get the smallest uh, subsidies or none at all. Food safety is an issue, of course, as you know. Also, the outbreaks that we hear about in the news frequently, salmonella and E. coli and listeria, mad cow disease is another one that's been mentioned from time to time, all resulting from all of those incidents resulting from large scale corporate manufacturing or mass production farming. After I read that chapter, I thought I needed to start writing down things I don't want to buy um, at my local Kroger. So seasonal labor, of course, is for large scale producers, not the small family farms necessarily, but the bigger farm seasonal workers are are the thing that keeps them going. And in the farming area, I mean, this is where a lot of our undocumented workers come from. And I years ago I heard a story, I think it was on NPR, about how the enforcement of trying to catch people coming across the border really gets much lighter during the growing season, and is much more intensified after the growing season ends. And there is this sort of this implicit acknowledgement that the agriculture industry in this nation needs undocumented workers, because for the large part Americans won't work for the just the horrendous wages that these individuals earn, and the working conditions are terrible as well. Um, so these migrant workers will follow the crops around the nation, during the season or whatever. And but 61% of all farm workers were United States citizens. Now that doesn't mean that 49% are undocumented immigrants. There are a lot of people that are holding green cards that are legal immigrants, legal residents, but are not citizens as well. Only about 5% of the farm workers have health insurance, though. About a third of their family income, or about a third of them, have family income that's below the poverty line. And their living conditions are such that many of them sleep outdoors or in shacks or in their vehicles, in garages, and really in very unsafe and unhealthy environments. Some of them sleeping near the fields where the chemicals and pesticides are applied. And so not only are they exposed to those chemicals and pesticides as they work in the field, but as they sleep at night. And because of the fact that they're moving around constantly, um, it's very difficult for them to qualify for any of the federal assistance programs. Now, remember, illegal, undocumented immigrants aren't eligible for those programs, but legal non-residents may be. But and certainly U.S. citizens are, but because they move around so much For instance, Medicaid regulations being different from state to state. Every time they move, they have to apply again for Medicaid, and so what that means is they don't get a lot of those benefits that they would be eligible for. And in the case of for instance, Medicaid, that means that healthcare is going to be poor, and so all these health risks that are there, the contact with pesticides, exposure to sun, oftentimes with inadequate hydration or none at all, melanomas, pneumonias, influenza for kids, parasites, vitamin deficiencies, severe asthma, lower height, lower weight, skin infections, all these kinds of things are very prevalent in this population, and healthcare is going to be much more limited as a result of the fact that they don't have health insurance, and they oftentimes don't have a residency long enough to get and keep Medicaid benefits. Um, Likewise, their children education of the children are going to suffer because of the low income of these families. You know, there's a lot of pressure on kids to stay back and work the fields, and because the family needs their income. And it really makes me think of, if you've ever read The Jungle, we read this in my social welfare class every semester, and it really makes me think of the conditions of the immigrants in early 1900s in America. It's the same, really, much the same kinds of things going on there that I always mention to my introductory social welfare students, that don't think this because this book was written 100 years ago, these conditions don't apply to immigrants today, because they do. And this is one area where they certainly a lot of immigrants run into these issues. So anyway, only about a little more than half of migrant children graduate nationwide. And interestingly, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which really was to protect children against child labor, it makes exceptions for farm work, and it lowered legal age for working on farms to 12, and in some cases, with some exceptions, down to 10 years of age. Now, Cesar Chavez, you've heard of probably, was a advocate for farm workers in California in the 1960s. Was very famous, and he was a very charismatic young man who organized the farm workers. I think it was the grape growers in California, and organized strikes and these kinds of things, and was pretty successful. Got the attention. Bobby Kennedy met with Cesar Chavez during his presidential campaign. Unfortunately, the year that he was assassinated, uh, formed the United Farm Workers Union, and they really kind of agitated for improved working conditions and wages for farm workers. And the powers that be in California and elsewhere really, well, the boards were very conservative individuals that were very supportive of the industry as opposed to the workers, were appointed to these boards, and really kind of undercut and undermined the capacity of the farm workers unions to be effective. And today, there's just a few thousand workers nationwide in the UFW. And this is a trend. I'll mention again, for labor policy is not a chapter in this text, and it's too bad, because I wish it ought to be, but because there is a real push among our leadership all across the nation to undermine and diminish the influence of unions, worker unions, in all sorts of areas, and this is one of them. So the issues that the text goes into some detail on, and I'm just going to touch on here, of course, the corporatization of farming that we've mentioned. Did you notice ConAgra? I just want to read a little bit about this. It's in the text, and just for the purpose of emphasis, ConAgra is the largest distributor of agricultural chemicals in North America. Is one of the largest fertilizer producers in the world. Is the largest of three corporations that mill 80% of North America's wheat. Was the largest turkey producer and the fourth largest broiler, that's chicken, producer, producing its own poultry feed as well as its own livestock feed. The company hired growers to raise its birds and then process them in their own facilities. The poultry is then purchased as fryers under the name of Butterball, that, and further processed foods such as TV dinners and pot pies under the label of Banquet Marie calendars or Healthy Choice. ConAgra also owns 62 well-named brand names such as Act 2 popcorn, Rosarita, Banquet, Bertolli, Blue Bonnet, Chef Boyardee, David sunflower seeds, egg beaters, Fleischmann's, Golden's, Healthy Choice, Hebrew National, Hunt's, Jiffy Popcorn, Libby's, Marie Callender's, Orville Redenbacher's, Pam, Parquet, Peter Pan, Ranch Style, Ready Whip, Rosarita, Slim Jim, Swiss Miss, Van Camp's, Wesson, P.F. Chang's, Wolf and Denison's brand chili, and La Choy. All one company. Is it any wonder that small farmers are having issues? Genetic engineering is another, the whole idea of manipulating genes to create a trait that didn't previously exist in a species, and there's they're trying to improve their products and that kind of thing. The FDA claims that genetically modified foods are safe, but there hasn't been any thorough analysis of the long-term effects of GMOs, and so a lot of people are reluctant to buy genetic. Actually, there's been agitation to require that foods be labeled as genetically engineered or not genetically manufactured. And there's genetically manufactured seeds have their own pesticides in them or something like this. I don't know how that doesn't hurt us to consume the foods, but Monsanto and DuPont are two companies that are mentioned as being the largest, the domineering companies in the areas of genetically modified seeds. Incidentally, whether this is genetic modification or what, I read years ago that all the turkeys that we purchase, if you don't have a wild turkey at Thanksgiving, all the turkeys that wind up on your table at Thanksgiving time have been artificially inseminated, and the reason for that is because the turkeys have been engineered such that they have big breasts, and their breasts are so big that the males can't actually make contact with the females. This is what I was told one time. So NAFTA is mentioned in the textbook. The authors clearly don't like NAFTA or the potential of the Pacific Rim Agreement, which or Pacific Rim Partnership, which never actually has occurred, but that these free trade agreements promote agricultural trade without any consideration to the impact on local communities and family farms. Local selling. The farmers markets, of course, are multiplying around the nation, and a lot of that has to do with concerns about the very things we've just been talking about here. And there are programs now. I think the government is actually, it sounds like, is funding the farm to school program where they're assisting farmers in getting their own locally grown products to schools and into the cafeteria lunch line. As school lunches have been, at least the school lunches that I know my kids were getting when they were in school in Alaska, was just terrible. I don't know how they could. I was horrified at what was available for them. Some years ago, I remember there was a news item about, and I don't know what's happened to this system. I knew I haven't, it's been some years since I've lived in Alaska, but I remember the Anchorage School District was experimenting with the substitution of healthier foods, natural lunches for students, and higher protein items in the lunch menus than what was typically being served in the school district. And there were two or three schools, if I remember correctly, that had some sort of contract to get these fresher foods supplied. I don't remember exactly, but I remember that there was a rather large article once or twice in the daily news about the school district lunches, and the person responsible for the school lunch program said that they didn't want to feed these healthier foods to the students because the students wouldn't eat them, and they were throwing away the healthy stuff, and so the only thing the kids would eat was the upshot of this was the junk stuff that they were being fed. And my thought to that is that if you stop serving them this junk stuff, eventually they'll start eating the healthy stuff. Anyway, sometimes it's the tail wagging the dog, I think, in our world. Sustainable development, of course, the whole issue about, are we in meeting our own needs today, compromising the ability of our children and grandchildren to meet their own needs. And so, sustainability is another issue that has become more prominent in the farming policy and food policy in America. And finally, climate change. And of course, we could spend semesters talking about climate change and probably wouldn't change the mind of anybody who already has their minds made up. If you've never read Al Gore's book, An Inconvenient Truth, or seen the movie, or maybe it's just a movie. I think it isn't the book. I don't know. Watch the movie. It's eye opening. Um, Patterns of agriculture are going to change with all of these alterations in the climate. I'm reading about it in the news. You know, Indiana is a very heavily agricultural state, and reading about it in the news here all the time. You know, about what's going to happen to the farming industry over the next 2 or 3 decades if current weather patterns continue, and that kind of thing. And people are waking up to this on local levels. It's just that I'm not sure that our national leadership is there. So, just the irony in closing the chapter, the authors mentioned that I think is worth mentioning as I close out this talk, and that is tragically, many U.S. farmers now profit from food stamps, not because the program helps them control surplus farm goods, but because it provides them with food. It is a sad commentary when the producers of food are unable to purchase what they grow. Okay, with that, that's all for this talk, and I hope that you found it of use.